Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our session, especially those attending for the first time. A few housekeeping announcements before we start our session. All our materials are recorded, and we do publish them on our channels, online channels. The materials are owned by Open Themes, so unfortunately, no recording is allowed, apart from that by the Open Theme. Toilets on the corridor to your right-hand side, emergency exits on the corridor, very end, and then the assembly point is on the football pitch on your left-hand side, in case of an emergency. Moving to introducing our guest speaker for this session. Andy Gregg is the Chief Executive of Race on the Agenda organization. Race on the Agenda is social think tank and Black and ethnic minority organization. It focuses on race equality and issues concerning Black and ethnic minorities in its broad sense. So all groups that could be discriminated based on their color, ethnicity, and nationality. The floor is yours, Andy.
Okay.
Welcome.
Well, it's great to be here for two reasons. First of all, to see so many old friends, some who I haven't seen for really quite a long time, so great to see you. And secondly, because I used to live 2 streets down in the 1980s. This area was where I really discovered community activity and community activism. Indeed, I was involved in an organisation which then became Wolston and Elgin Community Homes, which is where we're now sitting. Originally, it was called the Wolterton and Elgin Action Group, and we did some wonderful things, including taking the then leader of Westminster Council to court and having the district auditor looking at some of her expenditure. And in the end, we got the people who lived here to own, which in effect they do, their own properties on this estate. So it's great to be here. And what Nana asked me to talk about really was this word with lots of syllables in it called multiculturalism, because I'm not sure that I understand it fully, although I've been working in it for many years, and I want to hear your views. So I'm hoping that I'll say a few remarks to start with, and then I really want to open it up to being much more interactive. But perhaps I should just say a little bit about who I am as well, just to add to what Nana's been saying, because I've been working with refugees from all over the world really for the last 20 years. It's been a great honour to work with some tremendous Sudanese refugees from both the north and the south. And I guess what I'm interested in hearing from you, given that you come from a highly multicultural and multi-ethnic country, those of you from Sudan, is how what we do here makes sense to you, and how you feel about all those issues that I know are really important in terms of Sudan. Here we are, of course, in London. In a few years' time, the really interesting thing about London will be that there will be no ethnic majority. Us people with my pigmentation, my skin colour, or who were born in the UK from British stock, will no longer be in a majority. And this is great. I think it means that for the first time probably since ancient Rome, it can be said of London that it really will be a world city, because it will not have a majority even of the people who come from the surrounding area. And of course, how we live together in those circumstances in London without an ethnic majority is going to be the real question, I think, for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Indeed, it was said by a very famous black activist of the last century, the 20th century, that the history of the 20th century would be the history of the colour line, by which they mean the Q, the colour bar. This was W.E.B. Du Bois. And I think that certainly in London, the history of London over the next century will be about how we get along with our different ethnicities, cultures, and identities in the widest sense. So multiculturalism is really interesting because, of course, what multiculturalism does is to prioritize not just ethnicity and race, but also other forms of culture. England's, or Britain, is strange in the sense that we have a kind of multicultural approach to things, but unlike some of the other countries, Australia, Canada in particular, who have actually a kind of government policy of multiculturalism, Britain has never had really a policy quite like that. And indeed, I think one of the issues that you might want to argue about why multiculturalism can be criticised here is because we've been a bit neglectful in many ways, because if multiculturalism is going to work, it needs to be resourced properly. And I think that's one of the issues that we may want to talk about later on. So just a few quick definitions, just so that we know what we think we're talking about. So two that I managed to pull down. First of all, one which said this: let us try to understand the most important features of multiculturalism. I think it's fair to say that the essence of multiculturalism is the idea that if one makes immigrants feel welcome by allowing them to retain their culture and by seeking to address discrimination against them, then they will reciprocate by embracing a British identity, whatever that is, and the values needed for a harmonious society. That's a very sort of liberal definition of multiculturalism. In 1966, the then Home Secretary said, "I do not regard integration as meaning the loss by immigrants of their own national characteristics and culture. I do not think that we need in this country a melting pot which will turn everybody out into a common mould as one of a series of carbon copies of people like me, people who are stereotypical, typical Englishmen." So he defined integration, therefore, not as a flattening process of assimilation, but as, and here is the really key quote, as equal opportunity, accompanied by cultural diversity in an atmosphere of mutual tolerance. Obviously, it was of its time, because he was talking about English men, which is something we wouldn't do anymore, I'm sure, and he was also talking as though the Scottish, the Welsh and the Irish didn't exist, so our own multicultural nature as a white or as an English, a British nation was itself slightly kind of missed by that. Someone wants to come in, I think. So, what I'm going to do, just very quickly, Asafal, hello, nice to see you, is, because I think we can reflect on whether that description actually means anything. I'm going to give you some positives, I think some positive things about multiculturalism. I'm then going to tell you what I think the attacks are and why I think that they actually are in danger of what we call throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I'm then going to make some suggestions about how we can actually try and think of a new form of multiculturalism that might work for the 21st century. Does that sound all right? And I'm going to try and do that fairly quickly so that you can tell me what you think. Okay, so positives. Positive things, I think, about multiculturalism, having grown up with it and having been a community activist in a multicultural London, is that multiculturalism does something which does not happen in France, does not happen in other parts of Europe, some other parts of Europe. It gives organisations and communities the opportunity to self-organise, to set up their own organisations. And indeed, when I first started as a community worker around here in the 1980s, there were already 30 or 40 different community organisations set up by different ethnic minority communities. There was a big Dominican community here, big Moroccan community here, and within those communities there were also Moroccan women's groups, there were Dominican music groups, so the community was able to express itself in ways that, for example, in France would be impossible even to this day. And I'll talk a bit about that later on. So, one positive, self-organisation, and also to give people pride in their culture and their cultural identity. The notion that you can be British and still have a Sudanese culture and eat different food from the kind of not terribly nice food that us English people tended to eat before you guys actually came along and told us what good food looked like, actually. So that's one thing. community organizations, and often for people arriving, let's say from Sudan, their first stop may well be with a community organization set up by Sudanese people. Now, some people don't want to get in touch with their own communities for obvious reasons, but many do, and for many people the first stop into integrating, if that's the word we're using, into the UK is through your own organizations. And I think that's something that I greatly celebrate, is the fact that people can organize in those ways. I think the other immediate thing for me about multiculturalism is that it is very clear that it is not about assimilation. Multiculturalism does not expect you to start suddenly becoming a Morris dancer or adopting, cultural tropes which we might have that, you don't want to do, and quite rightly so. So it's against assimilation, and in France they have a term for this, and it's a rather dangerous concept in my view, laïcité, which means secularism, roughly translated, although it's a kind of secularism that I think has become secular fundamentalism. Because I remember in the 1980s, one of the other key things that is very important for me about multiculturalism, and maybe seems paradoxical to you, is the whole issue of ethnic monitoring. If you have a society which is hugely unequal and institutionally racist, and that discriminates either actively or overtly actively or institutionally against some of its population, then to do something about that, you need to know what it is you're dealing with. And I remember in the 1980s huge arguments being led on the one hand by Ken Livingstone, who was then the leader of the GLC, and some of the other Labour councillors, and on the other hand some other people who were saying that ethnic monitoring, asking people questions about their ethnicity, was either, on the one hand, something we had to do if we were going to affect change, because to have change and policy around how you overcome racism, you need to know how it is and how many people are affected by that. And other people saying, oh, no, I don't want them to know where I live, I don't want them to know anything about me, those kinds of issues. I think it was a very good thing that we, on the left, won that argument. Now, I know it's a pain when you go to a meeting or you apply for a job and you have to fill in all these forms saying what your ethnicity is and the other things about you. But actually, if you compare that with the situation in France, where ethnic monitoring is seen as racist. I remember having a conversation with the head of the French Refugee Council once, and I said to him, okay, so Pierre-Henri was his name. Pierre-Henri, how many you're the Refugee Council in France, the France Terre d'Asile was the name of the organisation. How many refugees do you employ? Because surely, if you're the French Refugee Council, your job should be to integrate refugees, and there's no better way of doing that than employing them. And he said, no, André, because he was insisting in speaking in French. He was so worried about the French language disappearing that he insisted on speaking in French. Not very good for me, because my French ain't too good. André, he said, c'est le racisme, that's racism. To ask people questions about their ethnic identity in France is seen as racist. Now, one of the consequences of this, and I'm quoting the ex-president, a right-wing president to boot, Sarkozy, when there were huge riots in Paris and Marseille and various other cities during his time in office, he said, we can't do anything about it. And when people said, why can't we do anything about it? He said, because we just don't know who these people are. They are all citizens of France, but that's the only thing we can say about them. To do anything that looks at whether people from Martinique and Guadeloupe, so people from African Caribbean descent have particular problems, or looking at people from the Maghreb to see if they have, we can't do that because that's racism. So ethnic monitoring is racist for the French, and that notion of laïcité, which also of course results in very strict, in my view, or over strict stipulations about what women can wear, seem to me to be part of the problem rather than part of the solution. I think on balance, although I'm open to argument, and particularly discussion with women about these issues, but I think on balance my view is that that a multicultural model that effectively allows people to retain their cultural traditions up to a point, and where those cultural traditions cause no harm, seems to me to be the best situation that we can have. And I think there are just one or two other quick things I'd say in defense of multiculturalism, and then I'll start attacking it and then we can have a discussion. I think one of the other positive things about multiculturalism is that it allows for more, if you like, critique of the majority community. If you're in France and everybody is a citizen of France, actually it becomes very difficult to attack the system if you feel it's treating you badly. So I think one of the things about multiculturalism is that it doesn't privilege the white majority in the same way that happens, for example, in France. And that at least allows for everybody to challenge everybody else's cultural assumptions in ways that you just cannot do in France. Sorry, I know I'm knocking the French here. It's something that we Brits love to do all the time, so that's part of my kind of cultural heritage, if you like. I think the other thing that I would say about multiculturalism is it works very well in particularly hyper-diverse places like London, in places where there is less diversity. Often some of the cities up in the north of England, there are big issues, and where there are two big communities of largely white working class on the one hand and often Pakistani, Mirpuri people, where those situations have polarized, I think there are big problems. And all I would say about that is that I don't think those are to blame on multiculturalism per se. I think that those are to do with the history of deindustrialization, to do with class, to do with the fact that the housing allocation for Asian people when they arrived in those towns was riddled with racism, and that's why they can be seen as segregated or ghettoized. However, it's certainly true that people like to live with people who look and feel and have similar cultures to themselves, although there are large exceptions to that, because one of the interesting things about London is that the fastest growing group of people, cohort of young people in London, are people of mixed race, people of mixed heritage. Now that says something about integration, actually. This notion that it just is a fact, as some people who criticize multiculturalism say, it just is a fact that people like to live with people who are exactly the same as they are, I think is very challengeable, actually. So those are some really good things about multiculturalism, I think, although some of them, of course, are challengeable. One of the great thinkers about multiculturalism, a guy called Bhikkhu Parekh, who about 22 years ago now was put in charge by the government of doing a commission on the future of multi-ethnic Britain, said this about multiculturalism: if some groups wish to lead self-contained lives and avoid interaction with others, it should respect their choices so long as they meet the consensually derived basic conditions of the good life. A multicultural society should not repeat the mistake of its monocultural counterpart by requiring that all its communities should become multicultural. Indeed, it is precisely because it cherishes cultural plurality that it accommodates those that do not share its dominant cultural ethos. Well, what do we think about this? Integration and social cohesion have become the new names by which government tries to approach how we, as white and black people, live together. And I think actually those terms are more problematical than multiculturalism and more dangerous as well, and I'll go on to say why. by and large, I think the evidence shows that multiculturalism has worked pretty well, at least in some larger cities like London. So, for example, all the evidence shows that, by and large, minority ethnic people show very similar levels of belonging, and there was a big survey done called the Citizenship Survey, belonging both to Britain and to their local area. If you ask them questions about whether they belong, whether they feel part of it, they argue, they'll reply it in pretty much the same way as white, natural, indigenous British people will. And of course, one reason that BME people say they feel they belong to Britain is that they feel little or no conflict between their cultural and religious identity and being a full part of British society, and nor should they. So between 80 and 90% of everybody, black, white, BME, whatever, says that they do feel part of their neighbourhood, they do feel part of their locality, and they don't see any contradiction with being, for example, Muslim and British, or Sudanese and British, and so forth. I think there is an argument, however, that, although not one that I often make, that this has not been so, this has not gone down so well with the white British communities. So around a third of white British do not accept that people can belong to Britain while having a minority religious or cultural identity. Now, it seems to me like they are the problem, actually, and we need to be clear that trying to get people to realise that whatever Nigel Farage is saying, whatever the billboards, those disgusting billboards that are now going up are saying, Britain has become and will continue to be and cannot ever go back again on being a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-faith community. So we need to work out how some white British people are brought into this world that actually is changing around them in ways that I personally think are fantastic. But it is an issue. And I think one of the paradoxes, if you do a map of England and you show where the UKIP party is very strong, and you then superimpose that map of England on where larger proportions of black, Asian, minority ethnic people live, there is a negative correlation. That's to say, most UKIP people, or UKIP is strong in areas where they've probably never met anybody like some of you. And therefore, this is a paradox about racism, is that it's very often a fear of the other that actually is much bigger and much more terrifying because they don't know what the hell it is they're talking about. I mean, in London, we generally rub up along with each other. It's great to live in a street with 10 different nationalities. In Hull or in some of the cities, some of the small towns that are just for the first time having to confront issues of multi-ethnicity, it's not seen like that. And indeed in some areas where it's a very, very white, 99% white, those are the areas where there is most likely to be extremism and UKIP support in large numbers. So that's a paradox, actually, an interesting paradox, which it's worth confronting UKIP members with. So, that's, if you like, some of the good things about multiculturalism. I'm just going to spend about the same amount of time, if I can. Am I all right for
You're
time?
good on time, yeah.
Rehearsing some of the criticisms of it, and then I want to hear what you think. Does that sound all right?
We'll take a break and then come back for the discussion.
Yeah, great. Okay, so negatives about multiculturalism. Well, there are issues around identity politics. Identity can be a good or a bad thing, and getting hung up on your own identity can sometimes be an issue, especially if it diverts attention from other really important issues. And one criticism of multiculturalism is that it privileges a view of the world that makes thinking about class and about redistribution and the distribution of financial resources and money and power more rather than less difficult. So class can be put to the back of the agenda, and issues of race or other forms of identity go to the top. And there are some issues there about how we deal with that, I think, although I don't think any of them are insurmountable. For me, the most coherent criticism of multiculturalism is that it can very, very quickly become very lazy. And by lazy, what I mean is this lazy multiculturalism. It's kind of ethical relativism, really, which says it's all right, that's their culture. If they want to go and treat their women badly, or they want to kind of, force people into marriage, or if they want to do, that's their culture and they can just get on with it. Now that seems to me to be not just not good multiculturalism, that seems to me to be a really very dangerous attitude, and it certainly has been the case, I think, and some social services departments have been opened, have in my view been criticised quite rightly, because they have not taken into account the human rights of the people that they are dealing with. Multiculturalism, in my view, only works if it comes down under an umbrella of individual and universal, and indeed group, human rights. And that seems to me to be the way in which you can overcome this cultural relativism that prioritizes things that may not be good about particular cultures over other areas. There is a problem with, and I think it's a problem with the term community rather than the term multiculturalism, which is that when we talk about communities, we talk about the Sudanese community. Well, what the hell is that, for God's sake? I mean, you coming from Sudan, I think will admit that there isn't a Sudanese community. There may be more of one, ironically, in London than there is in Sudan, actually. And when people ask me about community and use the word community, I'm often a bit baffled, because community is a word that is often used about minorities rather than about majorities. So you hear the term community as in ethnic minority community all the time. I very seldom hear the term ethnic majority community, i.e. my lot, because actually we kind of just disappear. We kind of rule the whole thing. We have all the power, and you guys kind of have to kind of deal with that in a way, and we then other you by calling you a community. Now that is obviously very dangerous, and I think sometimes multiculturalism can fall into that kind of communalism, which I think is also dangerous. Another critique of multiculturalism, particularly in England, where, as I've said, there's no real government policy. There's multiculturalism has been compared really to sort of benign neglect. You must learn English, you're now told, but actually, unless you're a female Muslim, virtually all of the possibilities of you learning English have been taken away with cuts to adult education, as we were talking about earlier on. So actually, multiculturalism, if it's handled badly, can be an excuse for spending less money on you guys or on minority ethnic people and communities, and there's a big danger there, I think. Community leadership can be a problem, and I have to say, having observed community leadership over the years, by community leadership, it's very interesting, because when you say community leadership, people almost always think that you're talking, as you probably are, about ethnic minority community leadership. In my view, of course, community leadership done by us guys has not been particularly good in this country either, so I'm not going to be too critical of community leadership, except to say that I'm certainly aware of some community organisations that I think have been set up more because, for example, a doctor in, let's say, Chile has lost his status when he came here as a refugee and wants to set up a community organisation to be able to get some status back, given that he can't work as a doctor, then actually because he really wants to work with the people that he's supposed to be helping. And there are big issues about, and I'm afraid it's male community leadership that in my view is the problem here 99 times out of 100. So community leadership can be a problem, especially when that then gets pulled into, as it very often does, orthodox politics. And community leadership and orthodox politics can get very nasty, especially when the community leader says, okay, Tony Blair, I can deliver X thousand votes from my community for you. And this does happen from time to time, and it's not a positive thing. I think the intra-communal issues is the big one. If what you're doing is you're saying that people can retain their own cultural customs and so forth, then you have to be open, and we all have to be open, and certainly my culture needs to be much more open than it is to you criticising it for what it does badly. I'm really interested in some of the critiques that have been coming from some of my Muslim friends who say, blimey, you want to lecture us about how we've got to become more like you. I don't want to be a football supporter drinking and throwing up in the streets and all of this kind of stuff. So actually everybody's culture is open to criticism, but that's a good thing, and we need to continue to make sure that it is so. And therefore some of the things that happen within communities need to be aired, and I'm very suspicious of some of the communities I occasionally come across who say, no, we mustn't talk about that issue because that's washing our dirty linen in public. Now look, everybody has dirty linen, that's the nature of linen. Linen gets dirty. We all have to wash our dirty linen, and we have to talk about it, and we have to be clear about what it is, and it will be different in different communities, and we need to be open and honest about that. Lastly, I think it's true to say that multiculturalism works less well in highly divided places with a history of racism or segregation in housing like Bradford or Burnley. And it's also open to the argument that multiculturalism suits the middle classes. We can make some would say I've made a career out of it, actually. But for people who have to live every day with people who are very different from them, who they perceive as being in competition with them for schools and for health services and so forth, it's different. So those are some of the kind of main overall criticisms. I just want to talk about 3 people who've been very critical of multiculturalism recently. One is this very paradoxical figure who some of you will know called Trevor Phillips. Trevor Phillips used to be the head of the Commission for Race Equality and has become more and more, in my view, dangerous and right-wing over the past few years. Some of you may have seen a recent program he did, which was laughably called What British Muslims Really Think. Now, if he'd have used that title about my lot, what do white British people really think? Or if he'd used that particularly about the Jewish community, what do Jewish British people really think? He would have been, that program could never have been allowed out on a television show, because it plays straight into, and of course it does play straight into, the notion that Muslim people are somehow absolutely weird, and we can talk about them in ways that we would not be allowed to talk about white people or indeed Jewish people or other communities. So, Trevor Phillips' argument is that, and I quote, we are all sleepwalking into segregation, that it just happens to be the case that people like to live with people who look and like them, who have the same customs and practices, and that this is just part of human nature. I don't agree. All of this goes back in some ways to a famous American philosopher called Putnam, who said that it just is the case, hi Red, it just is the case that if you're confronted with diversity, you don't like it and you recoil from it. And he's had this view that what we do is we hunker down amongst people who look and feel like us, and we then set up segregated ghettos, and that's how human nature works. Well, I think if human nature worked like that, we probably still would be in the Stone Age, actually, and I think it's a pretty Stone Age kind of view that is what is going on here. So that's one criticism. Another criticism by a guy called David Goodhart, and all these people, interesting enough, claim to be liberals. David Goodhart's critique is that the welfare state is falling apart because we've got too many people who are not similar to the people who originally paid for it. In other words, the more diversity you have, the less trust you have, and for social welfare, for the welfare state to be trusted and used, you have to believe in the people who are contributing to it. I don't agree with that either. Indeed, all of the evidence shows the opposite, actually, that there's a whole series of researches that have been done into what's called contact theory, which shows that actually most people get on, they rub along, even if they're very, very different ethnic groups, and that's just how things are. It doesn't necessarily mean we all have to end up loving each other, although interestingly in London, as I've said before, that is what is happening actually, because the highest growing ethnic minority population are people of mixed race, mixed heritage. That seems to me to be the kind of vision of the world that I have spent my life promoting, and I want to continue to do so. I think there are some much more detailed arguments on both sides, which I won't go into here because I think I've been talking enough. But just to give you a flavour, that's multiculturalism as I see it, and of course I'm just one person, I'm no expert on this, although I've been thinking about it a lot. I'm really interested to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much. Such a rich introduction into multiculturalism. I think we'll take a quick break, 20 minutes, and we'll be back to discuss it. Right. I personally have a lot to say as well.
We can put the chairs around in a circle so that I'm not sitting behind a desk.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you should. Good. Hi.